That's it for announcements or just anything else I can think of. I'm eager to get into God's Word today. I'm excited about the message, and honestly, even just the last 48 hours, I was overwhelmed by the amount of information that I had. So probably just pages and pages of just observations that we could make about this conversation that Jesus has with a blind man and with the disciples and even with some angry religious leaders. And so there's a lot wrapped up in this story, but I want us to get there and quickly, and I want us to work through this chapter really just verse by verse. So if you would, take your Bibles and open up to John chapter 9. We're going to be in John chapter 9, and if you're visiting or you haven't been here for a while, then I want you to know we're actually looking at conversations with Jesus. We're learning more about who he is through the conversations he has with people, and we're spending the majority of our time, if not all of it, in the book of John. So really, it's a double-layered set of messages or sermon series, meaning we're talking about all the conversations most of the conversations that Jesus has with people to learn more about who he is, but we're doing that as a study through the book of John. So we're going to be in John chapter 9. John chapter 9 and John chapter 10 are connected, so we'll look at John 9 today, and then next week we'll look at John 10, and those two chapters are connected. So as we study John 9, it's kind of a part one to a two-part series in a way. So at the beginning of John chapter 9, we actually find Jesus. This comes after John chapter 8. We just looked at that the last few weeks. And do you guys remember John chapter 8, where Jesus actually has a run-in with the religious leaders of the day? And John chapter 8 is where Jesus says, I am the living water. If any man comes to me and drinks, he will never thirst again. You guys remember the context for that? That happens as the Jewish leaders in the middle of a feast called the Feast of Tents or the Feast of Tabernacles. So basically, once a year, everyone would gather in Jerusalem and they would have a week-long camp out. They would camp in tents to remind themselves of the wilderness wanderings as God delivered them from Egypt, years and years before that. So this was a festival of sorts, and they called it the Festival of Tents. And so at the end of this Festival of Tents, the high priest and his entourage would make this long walk down to where the pool of Siloam was. They'd have this silver pitcher, and they would fill up that water, or that pitcher with water from the pool of Siloam, and then they would go all the way back and they would sing songs of praise to God as they go back. Now this pitcher was a picture of fresh and living water. And Jesus, in the middle of that ceremony, I think as I'm imagining, it doesn't say when he said it or when he yelled, I am the living water, but it's in the context of that happening. So they're walking up and they've got this living water in a silver pitcher, and as they're walking back up, at some point Jesus says to the crowd, I am that living water. And anyone who comes to me will never thirst again. And if you'll remember, that's what set the Jews off. That's what really set the religious leaders off. Jesus not only interrupted a really precious tradition here, but he actually changed the object of worship there. And so he says that basically, I am the living water. And so the Jews get upset with him. Then at the end of this conversation where we see the woman caught in adultery, do you guys remember that just a few weeks ago? The woman was caught in adultery, and he's having this conversation with the religious leaders about this lady who was caught in adultery. And at the end of the story where Jesus offers grace and forgiveness and says, go and sin no more, what we learn is that it's at the end of this festival where they would put out those candles. They were huge candles, like maybe the size of one of these TV stands. Huge candles, and they would snuff out those candles at the end of the festival. So those candles were burning all day long for that entire week. They'd snuff out those candles, and this is a second time where Jesus actually cries out in the middle of something precious, like right in the middle of a traditional experience that everyone's having. He yells and he says, I am the light of the world. Anyone who comes to me will no longer live in darkness, but will have sight, will be able to see. That's the essence of what Jesus says. So he yells that right in the middle of something that's really traditional that they're doing. And once again, the Jews are upset with him. So he has proclaimed, I am the living water. I am the light of the world. And then on the heels of that, Jesus is walking out of the temple, and we're not sure if this happens right after that, like if it's a simultaneous event or not. But as I'm reading it, it seems to me that he's walking out of the temple. The day is ending. Who knows what time of day it is? And it says here in verse 9, which is where we pick up, chapter 9, verse 1, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been born blind from birth, or who had been blind from birth. Jesus is standing here as he looks at this man, and the way that it's worded makes me think that Jesus must have stopped and paused and looked at this man for some time. Maybe he sat next to him. Maybe he just sat down. Maybe he just stood there looking at him. But for whatever reason, the way it's worded, it makes me think that there was a pause there. Jesus was walking along. He saw a man who had been blind from birth, and then the disciples say in verse 2, Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins, or was it because of his parents' sins? And Jesus answered, it's not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus said. This happened so that the power of God, the works of God, the ability of God, the power of God might be seen or could be seen in him. The reason that I'm emphasizing this part here is because as Jesus stops, I think he pauses long enough for them to think, what is Jesus doing? What is Jesus thinking? And so then, rather than looking at this blind man with compassion, or knowing that Jesus has the ability to heal people, they actually want to enter into some kind of theological discourse, right? This sounds just so typical of students in the word, right? So this would be like seminary guys following around the rabbi, the master, and they see someone here who's really hurting. Jesus stops, he pauses, and he looks at them, and they go, you know, Jesus, what's the theological reasoning behind this guy's blindness? How about Jesus, this dude's blind, you're staring at him, I bet you could heal him, why don't you heal him? It's just curious to me that we would really prefer a theological debate sometimes over love. And I don't really want to nitpick that point, I don't think it's the main point. But Jesus actually is staring at this guy, and I think it's long enough for them to go, what's he thinking? What's he doing? And so they ask him, so what's going on with this guy? Why is he blind? Is it his own sin or is it his parents' sin? And there's a teaching in those days, and even still today, I think it pervades, you know, even our Christianity today, where people would assume that because we're going through a hard time or because we go through suffering, that it must be tied in some way to a specific sin or to our sin. Now, some of us are overwhelmed with guilt and shame, so that any little thing that happens to us, we associate it with the thing we've done wrong. It's just typical. And even in the time of Jesus, when they're looking at this guy who's blind, they're saying the same thing. He's blind. Is this his fault? Is there some sin that he did? Or was this the sin of his parents? And the reason they say the sin of his parents is because he was born this way. So maybe his mom or dad did something wrong and passed on this sin, this curse of blindness to his child. Now, there are more than one reason why God might allow us to go through suffering. And sometimes there is the disciplinary effect that God has on his children. Now, I would argue that the bulk of God's discipline of his children is instructive. In other words, when you sit down across from your child and teach them to look both ways before they cross the street, that's as much discipline as it is when they cross the street without looking and you have to put them in timeout or give a spanking or take away a toy or take away their movie for the night or whatever it is that you guys do. So what I guess I'm saying is that instructive discipline is as much discipline as corrective discipline is. And I think the bulk of God's discipline really is instructive. He's walking alongside us. He's teaching us. He's opening our eyes to see things. But there are circumstances where God disciplines his children in a corrective way. So there's no doubt. That's one reason sometimes we go through some of the hardship. The other thing is that God doesn't necessarily remove consequences. I think when we come to faith in Jesus Christ, he removes all condemnation. Meaning it will never be said of us, the verdict will never be in the end that you and I are condemned to be separated from God forever once we've received Christ as our Savior. He took that for us. I might even say he took that from us. We will never be totally, finally condemned because of our sin. The verdict will never be, leave my presence. We cannot live together forever. That will never be true of those who come to faith in Jesus Christ. But just because he has taken away from us our condemnation doesn't necessarily mean that he takes away all the consequences, right? So sometimes when we sin, we might actually say, okay, God's actually correcting my behavior, and so I'm having to go through this. And if that's the case, then it's probably best for you to talk with a brother that you trust or a sister that you trust or to someone in the church that you believe to really be following the Lord. Because I think to sort of come to that conclusion on your own is not always healthy. I think sometimes we just assume that whatever we're going through is a hardship that God caused, and it's because of this thing I did when I was 12 years old. You probably need someone to talk with you about that. So on the one hand, I think there are things we live with. There's guilt and shame. And then on the other hand, I think there's also just the natural consequences of what we've done. Racking up a ton of debt and then finding ourselves in a really difficult spot. Well, I mean, is that God punishing you? I don't know. It's probably just natural consequences of a few bad decisions here and there. Again, there's no condemnation. You're not going to be separated from God forever because of that, but you might have to endure some consequences because of that. So those are just a couple of examples of maybe, scenarios where we might be suffering. But here's another scenario. This man was born blind, and Jesus says it wasn't his fault, and it wasn't the fault of his parents. So then there is a suffering that is tied to sin, but not to any particular sin. Not to any sin I've done, or any sin that my parents have done, or any sin that you've done. And this would be what we call the effects of sin in the world. The world is a broken place. Our hearts, our minds are broken. There's enough that's gone wrong because of Adam and Eve and the sin that they committed in the garden that brought what we call the fall of man, which means that mankind fell. That we fell into sin and we gave way to sin's effects in the world. So some of us actually are born with brokenness. Maybe that's physically, maybe it's mentally, socially, maybe sexually, emotionally. There's any number of ways that we could actually be disfigured, deformed, disoriented by sin in the world. What I guess I'm wanting to say is there's actually a worldview. The Bible espouses a worldview that encompasses suffering apart from our own sin, the sin that we commit. So when we look out into the world and we see things that shouldn't be there, there's some of it is caused by direct sin of someone, terrorism and other kinds of evil things that happen in the world. And then there are other things that are not caused by any kind of sin that anyone committed in general, just happens that way. And when we see that, I think we have to acknowledge that sin exists in the world and it has caused brokenness. And those are the effects of sin. And Jesus kind of says that that's what's happening here. It's not because of anybody's specific sin. There's brokenness in the world. There's hurt all around us. And so as we look at the effects of sin in the world, I think Jesus says this was accomplished so that the power of God might be made manifest. That word made manifest is actually a word that means to make visible. So here we have a man who's been blind from birth, which means that he's pretty much in a hopeless, helpless scenario. If Jesus was going to heal somebody, I would imagine them to maybe have injured their eye, and then Jesus heals the injury. It doesn't happen that way. This guy is blind from birth, which means that for his whole life, he has been unable to see. And actually, he's been prevented from going to the temple. He's been prevented from going any further inside the temple than the other Gentiles or the other nations were allowed. There's been a lot that's been restricted because of his lack of sight. And Jesus says this man was blind so that we could see something. I think it's profound. This man is blind so that the work of God or the power of God might be seen by everyone around. Sometimes God allows us to go through even the sin we commit and also the effects of sin in the world. Sometimes God allows us to go through suffering because he does want to show his great power in our lives. Have you ever considered that? What about the sin that you struggle with? Right? What about the various kinds of sins we struggle with? Whatever it is that you wish would change about you, and I'm not just talking about hairstyle like curly to straight or straight to curly hair. I'm talking about the actual sins we don't like about ourselves, the things that we wish we could change, the things that we hope nobody finds out. Have you ever considered that actually you're struggling with something that maybe the person sitting next to you is not struggling with? It's your particular struggle. And what if God intends through that, by you yielding to him, by you doing battle with that, what if God intends to reveal himself to you in a powerful way that he might not be doing in the same way for someone else in this room? What I guess I want you to see is that the sin in our lives and the sin in this world, the brokenness that exists, the things that prevent us from what would otherwise be the way God intended it to be, is meant in many cases to teach us about the power of God, about his work in our lives. And I think rather than submitting to our sin and seeing ourselves as ridden with this sin and unable to overcome it, I think what might be more helpful is to see that God has actually allowed this to take place in my life, whether it's a sin I've committed or whether it's just brokenness in the world, an experience we're having because of just sin's existence in the world. What if God's allowing this so that we would learn more about who he is and learn about more about what he's done, his power? And what if in the end it drew us into trusting him more? I've said this before, but I remember I've gone through so many seasons in my own life where I've really wrestled with this. And I remember when we first started Anchor Church, that we were only 9 months into Anchor Church. And I remember thinking, at the time we were Cross Current Kempsville, and I remember even just 9 months in thinking, this thing's not going anywhere. I don't see how it's gonna. I had promised the core group that came with us, and some of you are here, I see you. I had promised us that within 4 to 6 weeks, well, not promised, okay, but I had indicated that I thought that within 4 to 6 months, we should probably be able to find a Sunday morning location. We went 3 years at Sunday nights. And I remember thinking, like the 9 months in, like, this is not going as I planned. This is actually going to fall apart. This is not going to go well. And I remember having a conversation with Jesus. This was happening in my head, of course. But I remember thinking, this is not the way I planned. And honestly, it's a little too hard than I thought it would be. Everything just seems to be harder than I realized. And I had this striking fear that it was all just going to fall apart. And I remember in my conscience, as I'm talking with the Lord, I remember just kind of realizing or having this conversation and Jesus saying to me, what if I asked you to plant this church and then it all fell apart, but you and I got closer because you had to trust me and our relationship was so much stronger at the end of that year? Would you be okay with that? No, I wasn't. I wasn't okay with that. No, I didn't want to go through a year of just, complete failure, as on my worst day. I didn't want to go through a year of complete failure. No, I didn't want to go through some of the hardship there. That's one example of quite a few situations I've found myself in. And in those situations, if we could hear the voice of God beckoning to us, we're going to talk about that next week. Jesus actually goes into chapter 10 saying that those who are his followers are ones that are familiar with his voice. So I want to save that little gem for next week. But what if, as we were going through some of the sin that's in our own life or some of the sin that exists in the world, if we would stop for a second and just listen to God's voice speaking to us? And what if he was saying, hey, as you go through this, can I walk with you? What would you say to him? Yeah. The reason I think that's so off-putting, and the reason I think for many of us that we might actually resist that is because of our own shame. It's because of not just the guilt, but the shame. Guilt is how we feel about what we've done. Shame is how we feel about who we are. And when we've done something that really feels like sin, it is sin. What we feel or think to ourselves then is that we don't deserve to be in the presence of God. We might even feel that way about the person we've offended. Shame says, I don't deserve to be in your presence. And people who put shame on others say, you don't deserve to be in my presence. And I think what we feel when we sin or when we experience sin is distance enough from God that we wonder if we can even be in his presence. You know that at times I've felt so guilty over my own sin or just my own waywardness, my own thoughts and my own behavior that at times I've had a difficult time even asking God to bless the food. It's been a long time since I've really felt that low, but I have felt that low before where I thought, I want to plead with God. I just want to ask him to bless the food. And this was, I guess, back when I was single. Now all three of the kids sort of fight for who's going to pray, which is fun to see sometimes. And then there's nights where none of them want to pray, and they're all just rebellious. And so I have to cast out the demons, and then we have to pray. But this really was, years and years ago. But I remember being so low at times that even just to stop and say, Lord, would you bless the food? And in the middle of my prayer, I would just say, I just don't feel like I'm worthy enough to even pray. Some of you may have felt that before. That's called shame. And actually here in this, what Jesus is saying is, no, this isn't something that this blind man needs to be ashamed of. This isn't something that he or his parents need to feel guilt for, although I'm sure they had been feeling this for his whole, 30 or 40 years. Jesus says, no, let's put that aside. This is actually something I hate to say it this way, but this is a gift for him. He's been made blind so that we would all see, and eventually he's going to get his sight too, but we would all see God's power. What if God's allowing you to go through what he's allowing you to go through so that God's power might be shown in you? Well, gosh, it changes my perspective a little bit. Doesn't make it easier. Doesn't make the pain go away. It just puts a little bit of perspective on what we're going through. And actually, in some way, it might actually help us to reach out and just grab a hold of who God is and say, Lord, I don't understand, and I don't feel good. This message didn't make me feel better. But one thing that I hope it does for us is that we hold on to the Lord and say, God, help me trust you. That's what happens to this guy at the very end of the story. So we're going to get to the very end of the story. But let me just kind of fast forward for a second, because at the very end of the story, Jesus comes and finds this man. And Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Basically, do you believe in the Messiah? And he says, I want to, but I don't know who he is. And Jesus says, I'm the Messiah. I'm the one. It's the one speaking to you. And he falls down and he begins to worship. What I guess I'm saying is that my hope is that for us, we at least make it to that first point where we say, like the blind man who was healed, I want to believe. I do. I want to trust you. I want to take a step of faith. Believe it or not, that is a step of faith. So let me get to that point. So now I'm going to reverse, or put it in. We don't use DVD. We use DVD players, right? Blu-ray players. So it sounds like rewind and fast forward are old terms. I might actually have to find what are the new terms for that. Is it still? I don't know. Anyway, so we're going to rewind and go back for a second. So Jesus says to this man, he does something fascinating. And really, I don't have time to get into everything that happens here, but I do want you to see a couple of things. They ask him in verse 3 is where Jesus says, it's not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. And then he says, we must quickly carry out the tasks assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. You guys remember Jesus saying, I'm the light of the world? This is Jesus saying again, that I am the light of the world. And he says something here that resonated with me. It's, again, not the main point of this passage, but Jesus is fully aware that his time on earth is limited. And you know what he says? We've got to be busy doing what God has called us to do. I think that stands for people that really stands across the board for all of us, but there's a couple of kinds of people that I really want to encourage you. You may find yourselves with children who are grown. Maybe that's the nicest way I can put it. You're 50 and older, something like that. 50 and better. And so you find yourself in a place where you're like Jesus, realizing that, hey, who knows how much time I've got left? Now, the truth is, anyone at any age has no idea how much time they have left. But I guess what I'm saying is there's two types of people. One, people with grandkids, and two, people who are in the military and are stationed here for some limited amount of time. All I want to do is encourage you to realize that for however long you've got, give everything you've got to do what God's calling you to do. Jesus himself is only doing ministry for 3 to 3.5 years. And as he's doing this healing, he says to his disciples, look, my time is not forever on this earth. And so I'm going to be doing what God the Father, what my Father tells me to do, and I'm going to be busy doing that. We better get to work doing what God has called us to do. The truth is that stands for any of us, whether you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But I want to encourage you, God's not finished with any of you. And you may feel like maybe you've only got just a year left in Hampton Roads. You may only have 6 months in Hampton Roads. There's a story of a gal who's been in our church. She's been a part of our church for about 4 months, and she leaves. She just left last Sunday for a training, and she'll be back. Her name is Bree. Do you guys know Bree? Have you seen Bree? She's been around. She joined, and when she came to Anchor, she said, I'm only going to be here for 6 months. But I'd like to join the church. I'd like to get involved. I'd like to start serving for as much time as I've got. And do you know that God has really just not only changed our lives because of her presence, but her own family has started to come to faith. Her own family has started to come, and it's been a beautiful thing to see. What I guess I'm saying is, look, you may only have 4 or 5 months. You don't know what God intends to do with you. It's always too soon to give up, and it's never too late to give in. I'm encouraging you to do that. That's what Jesus encourages his disciples to do. Again, not the main point, but I want you to see it. Then Jesus says, so I'm the light of the world. And then he did something in verse 6 that's just spectacular. He spit on the ground, and he made mud with the saliva, and he spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. And then he told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. And this Siloam, John tells us, means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Is that not amazing? There's a couple of things here. First, I want you to put yourself in the eyes of the blind man. So you're standing here and you can't see. And I guess I'm covering the mic. You're standing here and you can't see. And this guy comes up to you, and his disciples are all talking about sin, and you're listening and you're thinking, what are they? They must be talking about me. This feels really awkward, by the way. So he's thinking, they must be talking about me. And then he hears Jesus say, no, this is not his sin. This is not even the sin of his parents, but that God's power might be revealed, that God's power might be made visible. And then he spits on the ground. And if I'm a blind man, I'm wondering, what's this guy doing? He's spitting on the ground. Then he mixes up some clay, and then I guess Jesus might just grab him by the shoulders or something. I mean, it's probably, I think it's polite anyway to let someone know that you're going to do that. So my mom's deaf, and in the deaf community, it's culturally acceptable to actually tap someone on the shoulder before you just kind of get in their face or before you kind of come up on them real quickly from behind. So you kind of want to tap on the shoulder or something like that. That's what I'm imagining Jesus to do with this deaf guy. With this blind guy. He actually probably just kneels down, he spits on the ground, and with some saliva, which sounds just awesome, and then he makes some clay with it, and then as he makes this little bit of clay, I think it's probably just enough to cover his eyes, then he just kind of rubs it on his eyes, and he probably pulls the guy over and he says, hey, listen, I'm going to do something for you. It's going to be really cool, but just give me a second here. And then just kind of rubs it on his eyes, and I'm wondering what this guy's thinking, but for sure he can't see, and there's mud on his face now. And then Jesus says, I want you to go down to the pool of Siloam. I want you to wash off that mud, and then your sight will be restored. And he goes and does it right away. There's 2 things that I think are really key here. First is that Jesus uses clay to heal the man. There's a number of sources that speculate as to why Jesus uses clay in this scenario. There's other times where Jesus says, hey, be healed, and they're healed. Just with the word of his mouth, they're just healed. There's another time where Jesus uses spit, and he actually just kind of spits in the guy's face, and the guy, he gets his sight. So for whatever reason, Jesus uses clay. And real quickly, as we look at the purpose for John writing this book, I want you to hear something, and then I want your mind to go back to creation. This is from John chapter 1. It's not going to be on the screen. I just want you to hear it. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. Do you guys see any connections? I can't be the only one that sees those connections. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. Anyone who comes to me will no longer walk in darkness. This is the same Jesus, the same light of the world that he's talking about at the very first chapter. John is, I think, alluding to Jesus Christ being not only the light of the world that he said was the Word who was in the beginning, who God used to create all things through the Word, which is Jesus Christ himself, which is God. He actually shows him to be not only Messiah, but to be God himself. I think as he dips down and makes clay, it's sort of a picture of the work that God does when he makes Adam and Eve. He takes them from the dirt and then just makes it. I wonder if Jesus isn't, I personally believe that it was Jesus Christ in the beginning, in the garden, through God himself actually creating the world and creating mankind. That's what John says happened. So here's what I'm wondering, is this guy is blind and he's sitting there, Jesus spits on the ground and he makes some mud, and in a minute there's just a flashback to when he created the worlds themselves. And he puts this mud on the guy's eyes, And for me, I think what John wants the reader to understand is that who we're dealing with here is Messiah, the God of the universe. That's who we're dealing with. We're not dealing with just a prophet. That's who the religious leaders want to say that he is. When they ask this blind man, how did you get healed? He says, well, this guy came and he put mud on my eyes. I went down and washed it off and then I could see again. And they say, well, who do you think he is? And he says, I think he's a prophet. He's not just a prophet, though. He's not just a good man. He's not just a miracle worker. He's not just a lucky charm. He's not just someone that you can kind of appease by going to church or writing a check every now and then and putting it in the offering box or helping someone out in a really kind gesture. He's more than that. We're talking about God himself. And I feel like it's a picture in a way of who Jesus is. And then the second thing is Jesus sends him down to the pool of Siloam. That's John even tells us that the word means sent or sent one. There's a couple of times in the Old Testament, in Genesis chapter 49 and then in Isaiah chapter 8, there's a couple of places in the Old Testament where it talks about this pool of Siloam, or it talks about Shiloh or Siloam will come. And basically, it's an allusion to the coming of the Messiah, the promised one. And Jesus, I think, does a double whammy here. First, he indicates, look, I'm God with creative power. I can also create sight where there is none. And then I think he says, go down to the pool of Siloam. I want you to wash in the pool that is called Sent, and I want you to see that I'm the one who heals blindness. Did you know, and I might be wrong here, but I can't find anyone else in the Bible who has the ability to heal blindness. I don't think there's anyone else in the Bible who can heal blindness but God. In fact, when we read the story in John chapter 9, which we don't have time to do, I want you to read the rest of John chapter 9. The blind man himself is teaching the religious leaders, and that's what they get so mad at. They say, how are you, a sinner, going to teach us about what we know to be true? But what he's doing is he's actually teaching them. He says, can anyone heal blindness? Has it ever been told that anyone was able to heal blindness? And of course, the answer is no. No one has ever been able to do that. Did you know that there are several prophecies about the Messiah, the one who would come to deliver, that refer to the healing of blindness itself? In other words, no one has ever been able to heal blindness. Jesus is the only one in the Bible who heals blindness. And in the Old Testament, what we find is that actually God himself is the only one who heals blindness. It's like a syllogism of sorts. What we learn then is that Jesus is God, the one who heals blindness. Guys, that's amazing. I mean, if we were blind, I think we would feel the weight and significance of that. But that's just it. This blind man's condition, physical blindness, really is a picture of our condition apart from God. It's called spiritual blindness. And at the end here, when the religious leaders should have been rejoicing that someone has come with the power to heal blindness, they're actually rejecting it because of the fact that he did it on the Sabbath. He broke our rules while he was doing it, so we certainly can't follow him. The truth is, actually, they were so blinded by their own rules, they were so blinded by their own traditions, so blinded by their own power struggle that they couldn't see who Jesus was. They couldn't see what Jesus said was to be made visible, which was the power of God to heal this man who was blind. And Jesus says at the end of John chapter 9, something that I think is fascinating, and I want you to see that with me. So I'm gonna go here to verse 35. It says, when Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? Verse 36, the man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. And Jesus says, probably with tears in his eyes, you have seen him, Jesus says, and he is speaking to you. Meaning, I'm the one. And in a minute, and immediately in verse 38, he says, yes, Lord. Yes, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered into the world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think that they see that they're actually blind. Some Pharisees, or the religious leaders who were standing nearby, heard him and said, are you saying that we're blind? And then Jesus says in verse 41, he says, if you were blind, then you wouldn't be guilty. But you remain guilty because you claim you can see. The Bible teaches in John chapter 3 and verse 16, same book, just a few chapters earlier in John chapter 3, that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but will have eternal life, will live forever with God. And then at the very end of that chapter, it says that for all those who believe on Jesus Christ are not condemned, and those who do not believe in Jesus Christ are condemned already. They are already under the wrath of God, the weight of his coming judgment. What Jesus is saying is, man, if these guys could just admit that they were blind, then he could heal their loss of sight. But they won't. They think they can see. And in the end, because they think they can see, they will die blind. You know who was healed in this story? The blind guy. And I think that says a lot about our own condition. I think if we embrace who we are and what God has come to do, it starts with humility and it leads us to repentance. It leads us to turn and say, God, I don't see as clearly as I need to see. For some of us, maybe you've never become a Christian. You could go your entire life living like you think you can see the world. And you might even think that you see things a little clearer than people who believe in Jesus. The truth is, unless you admit that you don't see clearly and that you've been mistaken for most of your life, then you'll never actually come to receive Jesus Christ and have your eyes opened to the truth. That's a bad condition. I don't want that for any of us. What happens here in this story is that Jesus says, look, I've come to give life, and I've come so that the power of God might be seen. So I'm asking you to pray with me and invite God's power into our lives, that he might awaken our spiritual blindness and turn it into sight so that we can see who he is. And so we can do like this blind man. Hey, look, I want to follow you. I just don't know who he is. And to have Jesus say, it's me. I'm here. I'm right in front of you. And the voice you're hearing is mine. It's me calling you to follow me. And what does this blind guy do? Same thing he did when Jesus said, go wash. He just does it immediately. He says, Lord, I believe. And he falls down to worship him. When we come to this table, I want you to do that. I want you to take a step of faith. And all I want you to say is, Lord, I believe. I'm begging you to say it. I don't care if you've never been a Christian before or if you've been one for 100 years. Just come to the table and say, Lord, I believe. Help me. Help me believe.